Back in 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of Europe, made what was probably the single biggest mistake of his entire career. He gathered the largest European army ever seen and marched them into a campaign that wouldn't just fail, it would completely swallow his army whole and start the unraveling of his empire. So how did it all go so spectacularly wrong? Let's get into it.
Okay, to really feel the weight of this disaster, you have to understand the sheer scale of the force we're talking about. 680,000. That's how many soldiers were in the Grande Armée when it crossed into Russia. An army of a size nobody had ever seen before, pulled from all across the continent, and they were all absolutely sure this would be a quick, easy victory.
And the result of all that? Well, over 90% of that massive, confident army never made it out of Russia alive. The campaign started in June and was over by December of that same year. What was left behind was a trail of death and destruction that is, frankly, hard to even wrap your head around.
And that brings us to the big question, right? How could an army led by a military genius, a force that had conquered most of Europe, be so totally and completely wiped out in just 6 months? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was a whole cascade of deadly mistakes and brutal, brutal realities.
To really understand the disaster, you have to go back to the very first decision that set everything in motion. Why on earth invade Russia in the first place? Even with his advisors screaming at him not to, Napoleon felt like he was being backed into a corner by politics and economics.
So a lot of it starts with this thing called the continental system. Think of it as Napoleon's grand plan for economic warfare against his arch-rival Great Britain. He basically made it illegal for any country under his thumb to trade with the British. The problem was, Russia's economy really depended on that trade, and eventually they pulled out. For Napoleon, that was an act of defiance he just couldn't let slide.
But it wasn't just about the blockade. There were also squabbles over territory, specifically Poland, which Russia saw as a major threat on its border. Napoleon also had this idea that a quick, crushing military victory would force Tsar Alexander right back to the negotiating table, but on his terms. And in a pretty clever PR move, he even called the invasion the Second Polish War to get Polish nationalists who dreamed of independence from Russia to rally to his side.
So, the invasion kicks off in June of 1812. Napoleon's strategy was classic him. Force one huge, decisive battle. Smash the Russian army to bits and then dictate the peace terms. Simple, right? Except Russia wasn't about to play by his rules.
Yeah, instead of meeting the Grande Armée for a big showdown, the Russians just laughed. They kept retreating, pulling Napoleon's army further and further into the vast, empty Russian heartland. For a general like Napoleon, whose whole career was built on quick, decisive battles, this was absolutely maddening. He was winning little fights here and there, but the main prize, the destruction of the Russian army, was always just over the horizon.
And as they retreated, the Russians used a horrifyingly effective tactic, scorched earth. They torched their own villages, they poisoned wells, they destroyed all the crops. It was a strategy of total self-destruction, all designed to starve the invaders. And let me tell you, it worked. It really unnerved the French army.
And this brings us to what was, you could argue, Napoleon's single greatest miscalculation. It's the one thing that basically doomed the entire campaign before the first major battle was even fought: logistics.
See, Napoleon's whole war machine, his entire playbook, was built on one principle. The army lives off the land it's marching through. And in Central Europe, with its dense populations, rich farms, and good roads, that worked like a charm. But Russia was a whole different world. The population was sparse, the farmland was poor, the roads were basically just mud tracks, and on top of all that, the Russians were burning everything in their path. His winning formula was about to become his undoing.
The fallout from this was immediate and just catastrophic. Long before they even got to a real battle, the Grande Armée was already being hollowed out from the inside. The supply wagons got hopelessly stuck in the mud. They just couldn't keep up. Soldiers started starving. They were drinking from muddy puddles, getting sick with diseases like typhus and dysentery. It was a nightmare.
So finally, in September, almost 3 months into this thing, the Russians decided to make a stand. What followed was the single bloodiest day of the entire Napoleonic era, and it led to Napoleon capturing a prize that turned out to be nothing more than a trap.
The Battle of Borodino. We're talking over 250,000 men clashing. In just one day, there were an estimated 70,000 casualties. Think about that. The French technically won, they forced the Russians to retreat, but the cost was absolutely staggering, and the Russian army, while beaten up, wasn't destroyed.
A week after that bloody battle, Napoleon marches triumphantly into Moscow. He's expecting a surrender delegation to meet him at the gates. Instead, he finds a ghost town. The city is completely empty. And then, soon after he arrives, fires start breaking out all over the city, deliberately set by Russian saboteurs. He had captured a capital, sure, but it was a hollow, burning shell. And the Tsar still refused to negotiate.
After a month stuck in a ruined city, with no peace deal on the horizon, Napoleon had no choice but to order a retreat. And this is where that famous myth of the campaign really takes hold, the story that the Great Army was defeated by the brutal Russian winter. But you know what? The truth is a lot more complicated.
Right, this famous saying popped up suggesting that General January and General February were the real victors. And look, the cold was absolutely a brutal factor, no doubt about it, especially for an army that wasn't prepared for it. But blaming everything on General Winter became this convenient excuse. It kind of hides what the real killers were.
Okay, so here's the grim reality. The #1 killer of the Grande Armée? Starvation. They were already starving on the march to Moscow. Number 2 was disease, especially typhus. Then you have hypothermia, you have desertion, and you have these relentless hit-and-run attacks from Russian Cossacks. But here's the absolute key takeaway. Most of the devastating losses, the bulk of the army, was already gone before the first snowflake of that truly brutal Russian winter ever fell.
The disaster in Russia wasn't just some failed campaign. It was the turning point. It was the moment everything changed. The shockwaves from this one single defeat would end up bringing down Napoleon's entire empire.
And the dominoes fell fast. First, the Grande Armée, the very tool of Napoleon's power, was just gone. And with it, his whole myth of being invincible was shattered. His enemies saw he was weak. So France's supposed allies, countries like Prussia and Austria, they broke their alliances and switched sides. This led directly to the forming of the Sixth Coalition, and a whole new war that would eventually end with Napoleon's final defeat and exile.
Which leaves us with one final big question to think about. When you look at the fatal flaws in logistics, the sheer size of the country, and Russia's absolute refusal to fight on Napoleon's terms, was this invasion doomed from the moment it started? Or was it Napoleon's own pride, his own hubris, his belief that the strategies that worked in Europe would work anywhere, that was the real cause of the disaster? It's a question historians still argue about to this day.